the access code objective. So Steve Edwell mentioned that the access code hasn't sort of been changed in 16 years. And at the time that it was actually sort of set up in 2004, the access code objective was linked to competition principles agreement that was signed between the states and the Commonwealth Government. There's been a few changes since this time, with the access code objective currently sort of providing for the regulation of access to energy, electricity network services through the access arrangement process, and as Mina noted, the technical parameters for equipment connected to networks and the security and reliability of the systems in accordance with the technical rules. So the task force saw an opportunity to revise the access code objective as a result of the proposed changes to the Pilbara electricity networks being progressed by the state government, with a view to maintaining consistency across the regulation of electricity networks in WA, and also the changes to the regulation of electricity networks at a national level as a result of the establishment of the National Electricity Law in 2005. Given the changing nature of electricity networks and the services they provide, the task force is proposing that the new access code objective be sort of split into three elements. The first element will deal with the regulation of access to network services provided by networks, noting that this element has been amended to remove reference to the promotion of competition in markets upstream and downstream of networks, and instead will explicitly focus on the regulation of networks to be done in the long-term interest of consumers. This change is intended to recognise that the promotion of competition is not an end in of itself, but rather a means to improve outcomes for consumers. The second limb of the new access code is, as Mina noted, a focus on safety, reliability and security of covered networks, and this is to facilitate the development of the technical rules. This element seeks to reflect the task force focus on the security and reliability of electricity supplies in response to technological change, particularly in response to the integration of distributed energy resources. And the third element of the new access code objective is a focus on sustainability and the environmental consequences of energy supply and consumption. This element is predicated on the potential for technological change to facilitate environmental objectives with respect to energy. You might sort of argue that the access code may not be the best place for this, and that the EI Act would probably be a better place to have an environmental objective such that it sort of percolates into subsidiary instruments. However, you know, one small step for WA, one giant leap for the regulation of electricity networks. So we have at this stage popped it in here, and it's a recognition that customers often seek environmental objectives when installing their DER, recognition that energy companies are trying to become net carbon neutral by the middle of the century, and that at some stage carbon reduction has the potential to become an important element of the electricity supply chain. So the drafting of this particular limb of the access code objective has been based on prior work in relation to the Finkel review and some of the submissions that were put up in respect of that. And it is quite all-encompassing, so any stakeholder views on the proposed drafting that has been put out would be greatly welcome. On to the next slide. Which is me as well. So one of the other elements that Steve Edwell mentioned at the beginning is the ensuring efficient price signals. So pricing structures can be an important lever for network service providers to maximise utilisation of their existing networks. While it's retailers that ultimately determine the tariffs that customers face, allowing sort of network tariffs that encourage efficient utilisation of the network is a necessary first step for these signals to be passed through to consumers and can influence retailers' decisions regarding their tariffs. To help achieve this objective, the task force is proposing a number of changes to the access code. The first one is to revise and update the revenue and pricing principles that were actually under the code. The task force has sought to review and streamline these principles to better enable the provision of appropriate signals for the utilisation of and therefore efficient investment in the network. Specifically, a pricing objective that requires reference tariffs to reflect the efficient costs of providing the reference services associated with the tariffs, and the structure of reference tariffs needing to be able to be understood by consumers on these tariffs, including enabling a consumer to predict the likely annual changes in tariffs over an access arrangement. Noting that under the revised access code, that the definition relating to a customer has been amended such that it relates to both retailers and end-use customers. The second element of the pricing signals is the introduction of a tariff structure statement. To provide greater opportunities for retailers and end-use customers to engage in the formulation of reference tariffs that apply during an access arrangement, the task force is proposing two changes to the access code. Firstly, the decision relating to the types of reference tariffs to be provided by Western Power during an access arrangement is now to be conducted as part of the framework and approach, ahead of the actual access arrangement process. I will have a little bit of a discussion on this in a latter part of this presentation. Secondly, there will be a requirement for Western Power to submit this tariff structure statement with its access arrangement, and that it works in conjunction with its price list obligations. The tariff structure statement is intended to be a document that provides information on the structures of the tariffs to apply in the next access arrangement, the charging parameters for each of these tariffs, and the approach that Western Power will take in setting each tariff in its price list over the access arrangement. In developing its tariff structure statement, Western Power is required to consult with end-use customers such that they understand the economic rationale for the tariffs and understand the likely annual changes over an access arrangement period. The third element is in relation to the price shock mechanisms. The access code currently requires that tariffs move between pricing years in a manner that prevents sudden material tariff adjustments between succeeding years, but does not provide very much guidance on how this should be interpreted. In previous access arrangements, this has led to some challenges in relation to deferred revenue. As such, to provide Western Power and the ERA with greater discretion with how they mitigate tariff changes within and between access arrangements, the task force is proposing to remove explicit reference from the access code to the word price shock. Instead, within an access arrangement period, a pricing principle has been included that requires Western Power to set its reference tariffs in a way that minimises distortions to price signals for efficient use. This should enable Western Power to set each reference tariff in a way that reduces the incidence of sudden price movements within an access arrangement period. Further, to reduce the incidence of material tariff changes between access arrangements, amendments to the access code are being proposed that require the difference between the expected revenue and the target revenue for the last pricing year of an access arrangement period to be as close as possible. The task force acknowledges that in the short term, while this may have the effect of larger than expected tariff increases between access arrangement periods, over the longer term, this should reduce the likelihood of material tariff changes. And I think the next one is my last slide. So this is looking at advanced metering infrastructure. So as part of the AA4 process, Western Power sought a capital allowance to deploy advanced meters over this next 5-year period. The ERA approved a capital allowance to install the meters, but not the associated communications infrastructure. As a result, Western Power subsequently sought additional funding from the government for the communications element of the deployment of AMI. However, as the ERA did not approve this expenditure as part of the AA4 process, there's a risk that Western Power will not be able to recover the expenditure in future access arrangement periods. The task force considers that a complete advanced metering solution is essential to deliver a number of elements of the DER roadmap. specifically the aggregation and orchestration of DER resources and at the distribution level to enable the technical functionality to deliver safe, reliable and secure electricity supply. To that end, amendments are being proposed to the access code that will enable cost recovery of the communications component of the advanced metering infrastructure deployment. The proposed approach is to use similar provisions to those used for deferred revenue, that is to include a specific provision for metering as an input to the building block process that will enable Western Power to recover any communications expenditure over a period of 2 access arrangements or 10 years. Next slide, and thank you.
Okay, thanks James. Hi everyone. So I'm just going to be talking about the changes that are being progressed under the Improving Access workstream of the Energy Transformation Strategy. Okay, so the arrangements by which generators connect to Western Power's network are important because they determine the terms under which generators can export energy into the network. And for large generators that are connected to the transmission network, this in turn affects how they're able to participate in the wholesale electricity market. And so the current network access arrangements in the access code mean that where there's insufficient spare network capacity, generators that are seeking to connect to the network are required to bear the cost of augmenting the network themselves. The cost of this can be prohibitive and can create a barrier to investment in new generation capacity. So more recently, many generators have instead sought forms of non-standard access to the Western Power transmission network, and these forms of access allow their output to be curtailed where necessary to maintain safe and secure operation of the power system. But as the number of these arrangements has risen, the complexity involved in managing them has increased, and there's limited scope to allow more generation capacity to connect under these arrangements. So the reforms to the access framework for Western Power's network will enable generators to access the transmission network without the need to fund augmentation to increase network capacity. This improved network access arrangement will complement the new security constrained economic dispatch or SCED market design that's also being progressed through the Energy Transformation Strategy. And together, these network and market reforms will optimise the use of the existing grid and provide a greater return on investment for network infrastructure. So the proposed changes that we put into the access code aim to ensure that future contracts between network users and Western Power allow for the export of electricity into the network to be curtailed, including where curtailment occurs as a result of security constrained economic dispatch. There's also some changes that are proposed to ensure that decisions made by the Economic Regulation Authority and the Energy Disputes Arbitrator regarding network access related matters are consistent with this concept. And so this round of access code changes doesn't include the consequential changes to the model documents in the access code to reflect this concept. So changes to the model document will be considered as the task force undertakes further industry consultation on other required changes to the access framework during the second half of this year. And just on to the next slide. So the proposed changes to the access code also alter Western Power's obligations to permit users to transfer their rights under access contracts and to relocate their contracted capacity. So just to explain that a bit more. So firstly, network users will no longer be permitted to undertake a type of transfer of network capacity known as a bare transfer. This is where an existing network access contract holder can legally transfer its rights or its benefits under the access contract to a third party, whilst continuing to hold all the legal obligations. So this provision in the access code has been used extremely infrequently, and where it is used, it introduces administrative and commercial complexity into the contractual relationship, as the party that's been assigned the rights, so the party to whom the network services are provided, isn't the same party that owes the legal obligations under the contract, so that's the obligation to pay for the services. Removing this concept of bare transfers from the access code doesn't preclude an access holder transferring their rights and obligations under the access contract to a third party in accordance with other provisions in the access code and their access contract. It's just that specific type of transfer that's being removed. Secondly, the concept of contracted capacity and the ability to relocate that capacity from one connection point to another will no longer be relevant for the export of power into the network. This is because under the proposed changes, a generator's ability to connect to the grid will not be assessed on the basis of available network capacity at that location, but rather for both generation and loads. Western Power will be required to undertake the same assessment for either a transfer or an increase of capacity or demand for loads, and they may grant this or withhold its consent, for example, where the increase would impede their ability to provide a covered service or where there's other reasonable technical grounds for doing so. So essentially the same process would be followed for any request to increase generation capacity or maximum demand at a given point on the network, regardless of whether it's being reduced in another location. So that's a summary of changes that are being made under this work stream. And I'm just going to pass over to Rebecca now, who's going to talk about cost recovery for Western Power's constraint-related functions.
Thanks, Bron. Hi, everyone. So today I'll be talking about some minor changes to the access code to enable Western Power to cost recover for its new constraint-related functions. So I'll just quickly run through what constraint equations are, Western Power's new functions, and the proposed changes to the access code. So constraint equations are mathematical formula that describe power system limitations that affect how energy can flow through the network. So as you all know, we're moving to a constrained network access framework, as Bron just talked about, and also security constrained economic dispatch model. So this means that AMO will need to use constraint equations for two purposes. The first is that AMO will input constraint equations into the dispatch engine so that it calculates dispatch outcomes subject to technical constraints. This is so that it does not issue dispatch instructions that would lead to technical constraints of the network being violated. The second is that AMO will use constraint equations to inform allocation of capacity credits. Again, this is so that it does not allocate more capacity credits to a part of the network than it can physically handle. So AMO will develop the constraint equations using information it receives from Western Power on network limits, which we're calling limit advice. And limit advice includes both limit equations, so for example, line ratings, as well as some supporting information that assists AMO interpret the limit advice. So there's four main functions that Western Power will have relating to constraints. So the first is developing the limit advice that I just mentioned, and it will need to do this prior to market start, as well as updating it on an ongoing basis following market start. It must also provide that limit advice to AMO, as well as provide any additional information that AMO requests so that it can prepare the constraint equations. Thirdly, Western Power must also develop and maintain a market procedure that outlines how it will go about preparing limit advice. And this includes how it will go about developing risk margins, for example. So Western Power will prepare that market procedure as part of the reform program prior to market start, but it will then also be responsible for maintaining it after market start. And that includes running procedure change processes in the same way that AMO does for the procedures it looks after. And lastly, Western Power will also be required to support AMO prepare its congestion information resource. Now, this will be an area of AMO's website, the same as it has in the NEM, where it will publish constraint and congestion information. And so this includes the library of constraint equations and limit advice, but it will also include an annual congestion report. And this congestion report will include information on past congestion, but it will also include information on known matters that might affect congestion in the future. And this includes, say, network augmentations or new network connections. So Western Power will be responsible for providing information on augmentations, connections and the like to AMO so that it can include this information in its congestion report. So these four functions together are what we are referring to as Western Power's new constraint-related functions. So moving to the next slide. So these functions will be conferred on Western Power through the wholesale electricity market rules. And we've developed amending rules over the past year in consultation with the sector. So this includes that we've presented to our Transformation Design and Operation Working Group mid last year. and subsequently published a task force paper outlining the design decisions, including these new functions for Western Power. We also presented again to industry in December on the draft amending rules, and these went out for 6 weeks consultation. We've made some tweaks to the rules following stakeholder feedback, and we're hoping they'll be made by the Minister in the coming few weeks. So once those are made, they will commence shortly after, and this is because both Western Power as well as AMO and the ERA will have some functions they need to do prior to market start. In the case of Western Power, this means it will need to develop its limit advice as well as developing its market procedure. So and these amending rules are available on our energy transformation website for anyone who hasn't already seen them and wants to have a squiz. So we now need to make some minor amendments to the access code to enable Western Power to cost recover for these new constraint related functions through its access arrangements. Now, of course, Western Power will only be able to recover costs that it efficiently and prudently incurs, and these will be subject to all of the usual ERA approval processes. So what we're proposing to do is amend section 1.3 to include concepts of access reform costs and access reform work. And Western Power's development and provision of network constraints information will be included in the definition of access reform work. And that definition of network constraints information will cross-reference the WEM rule clauses that confer constraint-related functions on Western Power. So the WEM rules will say Western Power must do those 4 functions that I just talked about earlier, and then the access code will point to those clauses and say these are the things that Western Power can cost recover for, of course subject to Western Power approval, to ERA approval. So it's also worth pointing out that the definition of access reform work will also include Western Power's work on the inaugural WASP, which is what Noel spoke about earlier. So some very just minor changes there, all to just allow Western Power to cost recover for its constraints work and the inaugural WASP. So I think that is all from me, and I will pass over to James, who'll talk